Greetings, everyone. So glad you've joined me for another edition of Organizational Behavior Hack. I hope you're doing well. In this video, I would like to accomplish a few things today. First, I want to help you identify various types of decision-making models. And second, I would like to share some common decision-making traps and provide some recommendations on how to avoid them. But first, I want to define decision-making and understand its importance for organizations. Let's get started. Decision-making is basically identifying what choice should be made for policy and its implementation. Making decisions is one of the common functions of organizations. Financial corporations need to know where they should invest their money to obtain maximum returns. Governments want to implement policies that will positively impact citizens. Nonprofit organizations want to identify a mission that will solve societal problems and increase donations in support of such priorities. In many cases, decisions can have a dramatic and positive impact on the achievement of organizational goals. In other situations, decisions can also have a negative consequence as well. So it's vital that we understand how decisions are made and what can facilitate greater success in this area. Decision-making sounds straightforward, but it's actually very complex. Perhaps for this reason, there are many different schools of thought about decision-making. In this video, we will cover some of the predominant theories. They include rationality, bounded rationality, incrementalism, bureaucratic politics, groupthink, the garbage can model, and crisis decision-making. Let's explore each one briefly. Rationality is the first model of decision-making. Graham Allison wrote a book called The Essence of Decision, in which he examined President Kennedy's response to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Allison suggests that rationality is the classical model. It implies that we critically evaluate any given situation and then list and explore all of the alternative choices that we can make along with their pros and cons. The belief is that leaders and managers will make logical decisions if these steps are taken. A second model is somewhat similar to rational decision-making. However, this model assumes that we will have cognitive limits. Herbert Simon, in his well-known book Administrative Behavior, declares that it is impossible for people to fully understand issues along with the alternative courses of action and possible outcomes. Therefore, decision makers do the best they can with the information they have, and their decisions are satisfactory, if not fully maximizing benefits. Another theoretical view of decision-making is called incrementalism. Incrementalism implies that decision makers do not make dramatic changes to policies and operations. Charles Lindblom is known for his work in this area. He believes rational decision-making is not only impossible due to a lack of knowledge, he believes that differences in values and priorities result in a situation where governments are only able to make very small changes to the policies and programs that have been put in place. A variety of constraints limit the degree to which organizations can implement sweeping changes to policy. A different model of decision-making is referred to as bureaucratic politics. This model emphasizes internal bargaining that occurs within organizations. Graham Allison has written on this topic, but many others such as Richard Neuenstadt and Samuel Huntington have also examined the subject. The main assertion here is that units will often make decisions that benefit themselves rather than broader collective interests. A fifth model of decision-making is groupthink. This perspective was introduced by Irving Janis. He asserted that if people belong to a cohesive organization, they may strive for consensus to avoid interpersonal conflict. This results in a situation where alternative courses of action are not vetted and suboptimal choices result. A different model of decision-making was proposed by Michael Cohen, James March, and Johan Olson. Known as the garbage can model, this perspective accepts a lot of complexity in decision-making. The authors of this concept assert that 4 factors impact decisions. First, there are actual or perceived problems that must be addressed. Second, there are various solutions that have been proposed to resolve those problems. Third, a number of participants engage to influence the decision-making process. Finally, there are choice opportunities, internal or external variables that may impact decision-making. This could include the hiring of a new CEO or pressures from the outside to act in a certain way. Thus, decision-making according to this model is very messy and unpredictable, hence the name garbage can model. As can be seen, some of the models of decision-making are based on studies of routine situations. However, others are more concerned about unusual circumstances, regardless of whether they relate to national security, public relations, or other emergencies and disasters. This brings up a number of scholars and practitioners who have written about crisis decision-making. One of them is Ezekiel Dror. He says that crises and disasters are characterized by several features. First, facing adversity. There are a number of things that have to be done, and the outcome is of high stakes so that any decision will have significant impact upon the well-being of the organization or others. Second, compressed time. There is an urgency to act quickly. This could limit your ability to really understand the problem and different ways of addressing it. Third, tragic choice. There are drawbacks to nearly every possible choice that could be made, and it is impossible to resolve all problems at once. Next, fuzzy gambling. There's a lot of uncertainty about the situation and what can be done to deal with it. Finally, strain and stress. Crises take a toll on decision makers physically and emotionally. The work, lack of sleep, and constant pressures limit cognitive abilities. As has been illustrated, there are several different views on how decisions are made, and there are numerous complexities that result in suboptimal decisions. 3 experts on decision-making wrote a very important article that was published by the Harvard Business Review. While the publication is somewhat dated, the perspectives about decision-making may be timeless. Let's look at some of those potential problems and how they may be overcome. The first trap mentioned in this article is anchoring. This implies that we tend to give more credence to the first information we receive about a situation. A good example of this is Hurricane Katrina. The Bush administration was initially told that the levees survived the storm and that there was minimal flooding. This understanding resulted in the federal government not taking the disaster as seriously as it should have during the initial hours of the response. To avoid this trap, it is advisable that you seek multiple sources of information and that you don't rely on the first impressions that you are given. A second and related trap is framing. Framing implies the way you define a problem or issue in the first place. A notable example of framing is the defund the police movement. In recent years, some politicians and community groups assume that all police are racist and violent, and therefore the entire police force must be defunded. There is no doubt that the history of policing is not perfect, and there are very disturbing cases of unjustified deaths, for example George Floyd. But this does not mean that police departments should be eliminated or that police officers and the law should not be supported. This has only led to increased crime in many cities and states. A better approach would have been to stress the need for reform, whether that's through increased training or with better supervision, counseling, and discipline. To avert the framing trap, decision makers should closely examine how you are perceiving an issue. Consider how your viewpoint may negatively affect decision outcomes as well. A similar decision-making trap is called confirming evidence. This suggests that we seek out and accept data that supports our initial premonition. There was a case where I was told as a leader that an employee was doing something wrong. Because I had personally seen this individual make a mistake in the past, I assumed that the information was accurate. When I talked to the individual, I learned that the information was incorrect and that there was a very different explanation for what had happened and why it occurred. I felt terrible that I had fallen into this trap. The point is to make sure that you're not swayed by a single fact. giving equal consideration to all evidence, and asking someone to look at alternative explanations may be necessary. Status quo is a fourth type of decision-making trap. This occurs when we want to maintain a particular course of action because it limits change and disruption. A great example of this is the continued habitation of locations that are extremely hazardous. Coming back to our Hurricane Katrina example, some scholars and practitioners have suggested that it would be best not to inhabit the low-lying areas in New Orleans. The risk for flooding is simply too great. However, relocating people, their homes, businesses, and schools would be very disruptive and expensive. Therefore, politicians and people choose to live in the same area. To overcome this challenge, it is advisable that you carefully review your objectives and consider various options along with their pros and cons. A fifth decision-making trap, which is somewhat similar to the status quo, is known as sunk costs. In this case, an organization may choose to stay the course because they have already invested a lot of time, energy, and resources into prior decision. Imagine the example of an automobile assembly line. The company has already invested millions of dollars into manufacturing equipment. Although new technologies have emerged to increase productivity and efficiency, leaders of the business forego the purchase of new manufacturing equipment in order to save money. However, this viewpoint could be flawed because the old equipment breaks down frequently and limits productivity. The best way to circumvent this potential trap is to critically evaluate why you are committed to a prior decision and be open to seeing if there's a more logical option for the future. A final decision-making error is called estimating or forecasting. This implies that our anticipation about outcomes could be overly optimistic or pessimistic. There are two types of mistakes here. First, we could be overconfident in our decision. A government agency may assume that its policy choice will be effective, even though there is some evidence that the program will be mediocre at best. Second, we could be so prudent and concerned about consequences that we experience what is known as analysis paralysis. We simply don't want to take any chances and we don't make a decision. Some ways to prevent estimating and forecasting problems are to evaluate your assumptions and be realistic about best and worst case scenarios. So, based on what we've discussed so far, decision makers can be impacted by anchoring, framing, confirming evidence, the status quo, sunk costs, and estimating or forecasting. Hammond, Keeney, and Rifa therefore suggest that leaders and managers must be more aware of assumptions and outcomes when they consider alternative courses of action. To summarize, decision-making is nothing more than determining what choice to follow for policy and implementation. Decisions are one of the most important functions for organizations, and no doubt they may produce positive or negative outcomes. There are a number of perspectives about how decisions are made, and they range from rationality and bureaucratic politics to the garbage can model. Leaders and managers need to be aware of common pitfalls, and awareness can help us overcome incorrect framing, reconsider sunk costs and the status quo, or resolve overconfidence and excessive prudence. So the goal of organizations is to make good decisions, and the research in this area can help leaders and managers do just that. Well, I've taken a lot of your time again today, but I do hope this information was helpful. Please give a like to this video if that was the case, and have a great day.